when you think about the infrastructure that makes modern life possible, um, your mind probably goes straight to steel beams or, fiber optic cables.
Right, or the physical servers humming away in some massive data center.
Yeah, exactly. But there is this silent, invisible architecture underlying all of that. I mean, before a suspension bridge can hold the weight of morning traffic, or before an encryption algorithm can secure your digital wallet.
Even before fluid dynamics can keep an airplane aloft.
Right. Someone had to write the syntax that makes those calculations possible.
Which is basically the operating system of the physical sciences. And the fascinating thing about this specific syntax is that unlike human languages, which, evolve chaotically over millennia through billions of interactions, this unified language of modern mathematics was largely standardized by one guy.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today we are looking at the life and the immense cognitive machinery of an 18th century Swiss mathematician named Johann Euler.
And he didn't just participate in the scientific revolution, he essentially drafted its modern alphabet.
Okay, let's unpack this, because our objective here isn't merely to list his discoveries. I mean, a simple catalog of his work would take hours.
Oh, easily. What we want to do is decode the actual mechanics of his mind. How did a boy pushed toward the clergy develop this architectural approach to mathematics that still underpins our world today?
Yeah, what was the underlying mechanism of his problem solving? And how did his physical deterioration, specifically his descent into total blindness, somehow act as an accelerant for his most complex work?
It is a wild story.
It really is. So let's start with the building of that mental architecture. You don't just wake up one day and decide to reformat the global language of mathematics.
Well, definitely not.
Euler was born in Basel, Switzerland in 1707. His father was a pastor who fully intended for his son to, take over the family profession. But his father had previously taken mathematics courses from Jacob Bernoulli.
Which is just a massive stroke of luck. I mean, the Bernoulli family at this time was essentially the ruling dynasty of European mathematics. So Euler, even as a kid, is inadvertently swimming in the wake of elite mathematical theory.
He enrolls at the University of Basel at age 13, which, even for the 18th century, is staggering.
Absolutely.
And this puts him in the orbit of Johann Bernoulli, Jacob's younger brother. But looking at how Bernoulli mentored this young prodigy, I kind of have to push back on the romance of this story.
How so?
Well, by modern pedagogical standards, Bernoulli sounds like a lazy, tenured professor who couldn't be bothered to actually teach. He flat out refused to give Euler private lessons.
Claiming he was too busy. Yeah.
Right. He just handed a teenager a stack of the most impenetrable math texts of the era and told him to figure it out himself. That's like getting Saturday office hours with Einstein, but only if you've already broken your brain trying to solve the homework first.
It looks completely negligent on paper, I'll give you that. But what's fascinating here is the cognitive conditioning that happens when you remove the instructor from the center of the learning process.
You think it was intentional?
I think so. Bernoulli wasn't abandoning him entirely. He offered Euler a single Saturday afternoon meeting each week, but only to address specific, insurmountable roadblocks that Euler had encountered.
So no hand-holding at all?
None. Bernoulli was forcing Euler to build his own internal scaffolding for problem-solving.
But doesn't that just invite immense frustration? I mean, you give a kid a dense treatise on calculus, offer no guidance, and expect him to just brute force his way through the logic. Most students would quit.
Oh, most definitely would. But for the ones who don't, it builds a specific kind of mental endurance. Euler later wrote that when Bernoulli would finally resolve one of his conceptual roadblocks on a Saturday, 10 others at once disappeared.
Wow. 10 at once.
Yeah. Bernoulli was teaching Euler how to hold complex, unresolved, multivariable problems in his working memory for days at a time. He wasn't just learning math, he was learning how to navigate intellectual friction without panicking.
Okay, so the struggle wasn't a byproduct of the teaching. The struggle was the curriculum itself.
Precisely. By forcing Euler to wrestle with the tangled, often contradictory notations of different mathematicians, Bernoulli accidentally created a student who just despised inefficiency.
He had to synthesize all that complex information.
Right, which instilled in him this desperate need to organize it.
Which transitions perfectly into his role as the architect of mathematical notation. Because when you look at the landscape of science before Euler, there was no unified API.
It was a mess.
Yeah, wait, so before Euler, were mathematicians essentially just writing in their own regional dialects?
Basically, yes. You had a mathematician in France using one set of symbols for calculus, someone in England using Isaac Newton's specific dot notation, and nobody could easily parse each other's equations without first learning a bespoke dialect.
That sounds like a massive bottleneck for innovation.
It was. Imagine trying to collaborate on an international engineering project, but every team uses a different base number system and entirely different symbols for addition and subtraction.
Just total chaos. And Euler looked at that chaos and started locking down the standards we still use today.
He really did. He popularized f of x for functions.
Right.
He locked in the Greek letter pi for the ratio of a circle's circumference to its diameter. He introduced e for the base of the natural logarithm, I for the imaginary unit, and the capital sigma for summations.
He wasn't just inventing symbols, though. He was building a streamlined syntax that allowed global science to communicate without translation errors.
Exactly. He essentially wrote the grammar rules that allowed for mathematical poetry. And the pinnacle of that poetry is Euler's formula.
Oh, man, where he shows how trigonometric functions are linked to complex exponential functions.
Right. E to the power of I times phi equals cosine of phi plus I times sine of phi. Richard Feynman actually called it the most remarkable formula in mathematics.
And when you take that and evaluate it at pi, you get Euler's identity. E to the I pi plus 1 equals 0.
Yes. Think about the philosophical weight of that single equation. He took the 5 most fundamental constants in mathematics, 0 representing nothingness, 1 representing unity, pi representing the geometry of space, e representing continuous growth, and I representing the imaginary plane.
And before Euler, these concepts lived in isolated silos. Right?
Exactly. Geometry, algebra, and imaginary numbers didn't really speak to one another. Euler forged a syntax that proved they were all intrinsically connected in a single, perfectly balanced equation.
It's like the mathematical equivalent of discovering that English, Mandarin, and Arabic all share the exact same root word for the universe.
That's a great way to put it. And he didn't just build the language, he used it to shatter existing paradigms, like the Basel problem.
Right. The Basel problem had stumped European mathematicians for nearly a century. People were trying to find the exact sum of the reciprocals of the squares of the natural numbers.
So 1 over 1 squared plus 1 over 2 squared plus 1 over 3 squared out to infinity.
It was a famous brick wall. The brightest minds could approximate the answer, but nobody could prove the exact infinite sum.
And Euler cracks it in his 20s.
But wait, how does a mind even approach an infinite sum? You can't just keep adding fractions forever.
Well, this is where his ability to cross-pollinate different fields becomes so evident. Euler didn't approach it as a simple arithmetic problem. He essentially treated the infinite series of fractions like the roots of a giant polynomial equation.
Okay.
Then he brought in trigonometry. He looked at the infinite power series expansion of the sine function. By manipulating that infinite series algebraically, he proved that the sum of those squared fractions is exactly pi squared over 6.
Pi squared over 6. He used a trigonometric function, something inherently tied to circles and waves, to solve a problem about discrete integers.
Yeah, he proved that infinite series in geometry are locked in a hidden dance. It was a breathtaking leap of lateral thinking that instantly made him the most famous mathematician in Europe.
Which naturally turns him into a highly sought-after commodity. I mean, 18th century Europe is the era of the enlightened despots. Monarchs are collecting brilliant scientists the way modern billionaires collect sports teams.
It was a total intellectual arms race.
Euler gets pulled to the Russian Academy in St. Petersburg. Then political instability forces him to accept an offer from Frederick the Great in Prussia, moving him to the Berlin Academy.
But moving from the Russian court to Frederick's court in Berlin required a massive cultural adjustment. Frederick's court was heavily modeled on the French Enlightenment.
So lots of philosophy and sharp rhetoric.
Exactly. It was a space that worshipped rhetorical debate and wit.
Here's where it gets really interesting. I imagine it like a brilliant, heads-down, back-end developer being thrust into a room full of charismatic marketing executives.
That is painfully accurate.
They might be working for the same company, but their value systems are entirely opposed. Frederick's favorite intellectual sparring partner was Voltaire, the ultimate rhetorical fencer. But Euler, on the other hand, was devoutly religious, incredibly literal, and completely unconcerned with philosophical irony.
He was a literalist in a court of satirists. Voltaire would run circles around him in debates about theology or metaphysics, largely because Euler had a stubborn habit of arguing aggressively about subjects outside his expertise.
So he was kind of a terrible debater.
Yeah, at least when it wasn't math. And Frederick actually found Euler unsophisticated because of it. There's that famous incident at the Sanssouci Summer Palace.
Oh, right. Frederick wanted these elaborate water fountains built, and he commanded Euler to calculate the force needed for the pumps to raise the water to the required height.
And the project was a total disaster. The wooden and lead pipes burst, the pumps couldn't generate the lift, and the fountains never worked.
And Frederick publicly mocked him, didn't he?
He did. He called him a cyclops and wrote that the vanity of geometry had rendered his mathematician's numbers useless.
Which is incredibly unfair, considering the physical reality of the era. Frederick blamed the math, but modern fluid dynamics engineers have looked at Euler's equations for those pumps. The math was flawless. Euler had calculated the perfect inviscid flow, the theoretical movement of fluid without friction.
Right, so the problem wasn't Euler's equations. The problem was 18th century material science.
Exactly.
You can calculate the perfect pressure system, but if the local blacksmith builds the pipes out of wood and cheap solder, they are going to burst under the physical strain. It was a failure of engineering execution, not theoretical mathematics.
But it cemented Frederick's bias that Euler was just an abstract calculator, completely detached from reality. Yet if you look at what Euler produced during his time in Berlin, he was arguably the greatest science communicator of his generation.
Oh, without a doubt. He was asked to tutor Frederick's niece, the Princess of Anhalt-Dessau. He wrote her over 200 letters explaining the mechanics of the universe, optics, gravity, logic, magnetism.
And those letters were later compiled into a book, Letters to a German Princess, which became a massive multinational bestseller.
Because he stripped away the equations. When he wasn't trying to spar with Voltaire, when he was just allowed to explain how the physical world worked, he didn't use jargon, he used logical syllogisms.
Proving he understood the concepts so deeply that he could explain them to a layperson without relying on the crutch of complex notation.
It remains a masterclass in scientific translation. But, as his fame was peaking, his physical connection to that world was aggressively deteriorating.
Yeah, this is the part of his life that just defies logic. In 1735, a severe fever nearly kills him, and the aftermath leaves him almost entirely blind in his right eye.
Which is why Frederick called him Cyclops.
Exactly. Fast forward to 1766, he develops a cataract in his healthy left eye, and the surgical techniques of the time were primitive at best. A botched operation leaves him almost totally blind.
So he spends the last 17 years of his life living in absolute darkness.
For a man who literally invented the visual notation of modern math, blindness should have been the end of his career. I mean, you cannot write complex algebraic calculus without seeing the page. The spatial arrangement of the symbols is the math.
Right, but his output actually accelerates. In 1775, totally blind, he's dictating, on average, one new mathematical paper every single week to his scribes.
Let's look at the mechanics of that. Is it possible that going blind was actually a benefit to his work? Euler himself said, "Now I will have fewer distractions."
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it goes back to our discussion of his early training with Bernoulli.
The mental endurance.
Exactly. Because Euler had an eidetic memory, he could recite Virgil's Aeneid word for word, knowing the first and last sentence of every page.
Wait, really? That's insane.
Yeah, and he could calculate the sixth powers of the first 100 prime numbers by heart, so he didn't need the physical paper. Writing out equations physically introduces a time delay. Your hand moves slower than your brain.
So it's like the chess grandmaster analogy. A grandmaster playing a dozen games blindfolded isn't picturing the wooden board and the physical pieces. They're picturing the network of threats and mathematical relationships between the squares.
Exactly. When the physical world went dark, Euler retreated entirely into the pure logic of his mind's eye. He manipulated hyper-complex matrices of variables mentally, holding the entire shifting architecture in his working memory, and simply dictated the final simplified steps to his assistants.
So the blindness basically stripped away the friction of the physical world.
It did.
Which makes his focus on intensely practical physical problems during this time even more remarkable. He wasn't just sitting in the dark thinking about abstract prime numbers. He was mapping the physical world.
Like when he invented graph theory through the Seven Bridges of Königsberg problem.
Right. Königsberg was a real Prussian city built on a river with two islands, connected by a network of 7 bridges. The citizens had this long-standing puzzle. Could you map a walking route that crossed every single bridge exactly once and return to your starting point?
And for decades, people were physically walking the bridges or tracing maps trying to find the hidden path. But Euler realizes that the physical map is a distraction.
How so?
He recognized that the size of the islands, the length of the bridges, and the geographic distance were entirely irrelevant. He abstracted the physical city down to nodes and edges. The land masses were just points, and the bridges were just lines connecting them.
Ah, so he invented topological thinking. He proved that the path is impossible unless every single landmass, except for your starting and ending points, has an even number of bridges connecting to it.
Because if you enter an island, you need a different bridge to exit.
Right. And since all 4 landmasses in Königsberg had an odd number of bridges, the puzzle was mathematically impossible. He solved the geographic problem by proving geography didn't matter.
And that abstraction, reducing a physical space to a network of relationships, is the foundational logic for the modern world. When your GPS app calculates the fastest route home, or when a routing protocol determines how a data packet travels across the internet, those algorithms are running on the graph theory Euler invented.
To solve a 17th century walking puzzle?
Yeah.
That is wild. And it wasn't just networks. Even while blind, he's calculating the Euler-Bernoulli beam equation, modeling how structural loads bend physical material.
Right, a cornerstone of structural engineering.
If you were sitting in a building right now, that invisible math is keeping the roof above your head. He even mathematically predicted cavitation, the formation of vapor bubbles in a liquid subjected to rapid changes of pressure.
Over a century before anyone had the industrial technology to physically observe it happening in a ship's propeller.
So what does this all mean? He's like the ultimate 18th century life hacker. He looked at a map of bridges or a piece of sheet music and saw the hidden matrix of code behind it.
Oh, speaking of music, he even attempted to incorporate music theory into mathematics, defining genres of octaves and intervals.
Which famously didn't work, right? The musicians found it too mathematical, and the mathematicians found it too musical.
Yeah, it was dismissed. But that attempt reveals something fundamental about his worldview. It shows his core belief that the universe, in all its forms, is governed by discoverable, rational patterns.
Whether it's the orbit of a celestial body or the resonance of a musical chord.
Exactly. He believed mathematics was the language of the universe, and his job was merely to transcribe it.
And he transcribed it until his body simply gave out. In 1783, living in St. Petersburg, he was having a normal afternoon. He ate lunch with his family, spent some time playing with his grandson, and then sat down with a colleague to calculate the orbit of the newly discovered planet Uranus.
And mid-calculation, he suffered a massive brain hemorrhage and collapsed.
Yeah. The Marquis de Condorcet, a brilliant French philosopher and mathematician, delivered the eulogy for the French Academy. He summarized Euler's passing with this incredibly stark, beautiful line. He said, "He ceased to calculate and to live."
He ceased to calculate and to live, as if the two functions were entirely synonymous.
It really feels that way. The legacy he left behind is almost incomprehensible in scale. Pierre-Simon Laplace routinely told the next generation of scientists, read Euler, read Euler. He is the master of us all.
And Carl Friedrich Gauss basically said that studying Euler was the only true education a mathematician needed.
Every time you use a modern structural formula or a spreadsheet or even basic logical diagrams like Euler diagrams, you are standing on his shoulders.
He standardized the alphabet that allowed the industrial and digital revolutions to take place.
Which brings us to a final thought to consider today. We spend a lot of time trying to optimize our environments, searching for the perfect tools, the perfect lighting, the friction-free path to productivity.
Yeah, we really do.
But Euler achieved his most enduring, paradigm-shifting work after his vision failed, when he was plunged into absolute darkness. He used his limitation to strip away distractions and rely completely on his internal memory.
He didn't just overcome his blindness, he utilized it.
Exactly. So it makes you reconsider the obstacles in your own life. What perceived limitation or disadvantage are you currently fighting against? What if that exact constraint is an untapped source of incredible focus if only you chose to view it differently? Something to mull over until next time.